Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability with me, Nigel Lake, this week in Australia, usually based in New York, and my co-host, Paul Herman, who is in France in Europe. We have some fantastic guests with us today, including Angelica Rotondaro from South America and Monica Richter, who's also based in Asia Pacific. And the objective today for our third anniversary, so it is now 3 years since we launched ESGX Live, is really to try to bring to life the many examples there are of really practical action already taking place. And despite all the grisly news of the last few weeks on many things related to climate change and environment, just to provide that, I don't want to say ray of hope, because it's much more than a hope, that inspiration that there is so much more we can all be doing. So with that as introduction, I invite my guests to join me on the digital stage here. For everyone who's with us on YouTube and other streaming services, please do share this episode with your friends. Please ask your questions. If you're here with us in Zoom, put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we very much look forward to the discussion. Fantastic, here we all are. So I would dive in straight away with Angelica, just to maybe give a very quick introduction to what you're doing, and in particular to talk about one of these really burning questions, which is everything to do with agriculture, new approaches to farming, because we all know that climate change is much in the news, but the challenges related to biodiversity and ecological degradation are in some ways more serious. So over to you for a quick introduction.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, and to the ESGX team for the invitation to be with you here today. For me, it's evening. It's 6 o'clock in São Paulo. I'm based in Brazil. I have been working with impact investing for over 10 years now. And with a focus on what we then call impact investing sustainable food chains. And then Brazil is a country very much known for the mainstream agricultural production, right? So it's I'd say it's an ocean of soybeans and sugarcane and corn. But nevertheless, the smallholders, the meatholder farmers that are, producing the food we eat. And then the point is how to connect, sorts of investing structures that will allow them to do and to continue doing this transition into more sustainable ways to produce food, together with, whenever possible, with carbon credits. So creating carbon credits and not excluding carbon credits.
Yeah, and I think this is the existential challenge in agriculture generally, is that the typical farmer is a smallholder, and that's clearly true in Brazil, it's true in Australia, it's true in the US and the UK. The average size of a farm, or even the median size of a farm, is tiny. And so how do you engage with the community in order to be able to drive the sorts of changes that you're trying to drive? So keep going, don't let me interrupt.
The smallholders in Brazil, in comparison to other countries, they may look not so small. Small varies according to the biome and to the region where they are. So you will find a smallholder with 30 hectares. You may also find a smallholder with 100 hectares or 200 hectares, because it depends very much on the biome. But in terms of access to market and in terms of income generation, it is a small holder. How we engage with them is with partners. So be it cooperatives, be it associations, or now we started working with companies as well that have the interface with these producers. So this also provides one of the sorts of the guarantees that I'm going to be talking about, because when we talk about impact investing, smallholders and meatholders, the conventional, the typical way to de-risk it or to check if it is possible to provide an investing on a credit line to them, has to do with the land title. So that's the traditional collateral. In many of the cases, this smallholder does not have the land title or the land title certificate. So how to then build a system that we have different sorts of guarantees to be able to provide this smallholder farmer with the needed financing. So that's one of the points that it's a bit tricky.
Fantastic. And Monica, I know you've had some involvement, maybe quite a lot of involvement with things related to agriculture and bioeconomy in Australia. Are there any parallels with what Monica's talking about? Any things you think are particularly exciting in this corner of the world?
Well, what we're starting to see, Nigel, is a conversation in Australia around how we protect biodiversity and how we also support regenerative agriculture. And, that's a really exciting conversation that is starting to occur, not just for the smallholders, but also the big end of town. You've got our major supermarket chains. They're looking to provide goods and to customers, because customers are demanding it, sourced responsibly, a lot of responsibly sourced goods going into supermarket chains, and that expectation that the agriculture sector will be able to deliver. And of course, farmers are also at the front end and very vulnerable to climate change impacts, and they're seeing the massive impacts of climate as they build resilience into their marketplace. So creating both the market and the policies and the programs to support farmers to continue to feed us, put food on the table, and is going to be important. But also, how do we develop a carbon market system that has integrity, is transparent, that is actually, says what it is on the label, reducing carbon emissions, providing those co-benefits. And, we in Australia have a very big focus also, and I'm sure in Brazil, other nations, around First Nations support and making sure that the things that are happening on the land, what we do on the land, that we engage very deeply with our First Nations people as well, not just through consultation, but also that they contribute and get direct contribution back to the communities in the country that they look after, because they are also very actively engaged, for example, in beef cattle farming in the rangelands in Australia. So, there is quite a significant opportunity, I think, to be driving decarbonisation, looking after biodiversity preservation through agriculture in Australia as well.
Fantastic. And I'm going to come back to that theme of effectively inclusion of everybody and the benefits of these things in a moment. What you're saying there prompts some thoughts around other parts of the world with similar challenges. I know in the UK, having spoken to some of the leading farming groups there, so this is people like the Cholmondeley estates and there's another big estate up in Norfolk that have been working on it or adopting originally organic practices and continuing to evolve that, going back really since the 1980s, because their land was already in a terrible shape then. And some of the lessons from that have been that it can be a long, slow path to drive the changes that are needed. And it has historically been hard to gather some of the data that you need to show that it's really working beyond simply yield improvements over time. But it certainly can be done and has been very successful. And another example I was going to mention briefly was in India. I know that there has been some quite significant efforts around regenerative rice farming, which has been very much focused on how do you get individuals to adopt the practices, because you can do all the science you want and the science is very sophisticated. And if you see the images of the difference between a rather weedy looking rice plant with not very much crop on it that doesn't look especially healthy, and a much more big, vibrant, bushy plant with about, looks like 3 or 4 times the crop, results are dramatically different. But you have to get thousands and thousands and tens and thousands of individuals to adopt those programs. So maybe it's a neat segue back to you, Angelica, around, you know, what is the path for engaging with farmers? How do you show them or help them with what they need to do to adopt new practices or better practices? And exactly also, as Monica was flagging, how do you make sure that if, you know, there are, for example, carbon credits, that a very significant slice of those, preferably most of them, find their way back to the underlying farmer, and they don't just get captured by intermediaries along the way, and the benefits in terms of better consumer pricing isn't all just taken by the person that's selling the green product to a consumer.
I think that the most difficult part of all this is to get a premium price at the end of this value chain or distribution chain. I think it's much more a distribution chain, right? So in terms of engaging the farmers, it has been the case in many parts of Brazil that the farmers already realized that climate change risk is knocking at their doors. So, you know, like 2 years ago, there was, really the amount of, for example, coffee, there was this extreme reduction because of the sudden cold weather. Or you have situations where you have an extreme dry season and lack of water. So this extreme weather conditions, it's very clear now for both smallholders and meatholders, and it has been influencing their production, right? So it has been really clear that they need to do something to change that. And then the point is what and how long is that gonna take, and who's gonna provide the technical assistance, who's gonna provide a financing which really fits in their pockets and that they're able to pay back. And as I said, is there gonna be a premium price at the end of the whole story? But then the way that we have been doing, I think that first, you know, when I say we have been working a lot in terms of providing this impact investing structures in climate smart agriculture together with the people from Rabobank Foundation, building a portfolio in Brazil. And with an initial focus in the savannah, in the Brazilian savannah, the Cerrado, because I think that Brazil, most of the time has always this image of Amazon. Right, all relates to the Amazon, but the Amazon is not the only big biome in Brazil. The second largest one is the Cerrado, and the Cerrado is the one that has been having the largest deforestation rate because it's mostly in an area which is flat, so it's easier to deforest it. And second, it is in the type of vegetation. It's easier to really easier to deforest Cerrado than it is to set fire in a humid forest, which is the case of the Amazon, right? But the highest deforestation rate last year was in the Cerrado. And that's the area we have been working a lot right now, and it's really with this small and mid holders. And what has been very interesting is because we have been working with these farmers for already 5 years. It's one financing line followed by the next financing line and increasing the indicators. And then I think that because of that, it's possible to see a change. So when we talk about landscape change and investing landscape restoration, that's possible to be seen if there is a consistent and ongoing financing structure that really focuses on a single area that start connecting landscapes with rivers, river basing and water basing. And then as part of this transition, so I think that the first two lines, it is in the form of a debt. It's a debt structure. So the first two were for this adaptation to agroecology. But the third one that we have been structuring has to do with agroforestry. And agroforestry together, so agroforestry or silvopastoral, right? So it's the forest together with cattle ranching, also in the same region, and then connecting it. You know, the way that this finance structure is being thought. It also brings together carbon credits to smallholder farmers. And how the carbon credits can also support the repayment of the finance that they have taken. But this is something that is being structured. The idea is that it's launched until the end of this year. And what we're doing right now is putting together the right partners and to engage the local government, especially because of this specific focus on restoration, on agroforestry, and on carbon credits. So that's what has been mostly this structure focused on this Cerrado area.
Fantastic, and it's a good example that, you know, there in many cases there are not simple one-step solutions. That it's much more about how do you deal with an entire kind of ecosystem of problem or of opportunity. And I know one good example of this in Africa is that there's a UK-based investment organisation, family office called United Green, which has been developing some quite large-scale regenerative agriculture projects in Africa. The first ones to be announced publicly are in Kenya, and they involve a whole series of agreements with federal governments, state governments, coordination with a whole variety of different stakeholders, where the underlying objective is to build or facilitate the creation of everything you need to have efficient local food production, most of which can be farmed by local growers, where you provide some central processing, perhaps some central marketing, and all of that is designed to address primarily domestic market needs. Because, you know, one of the things that I think we often, you know I certainly overlook in living in higher income countries is the cost of many basic things in low income nations can be very high, because to some extent they're driven by world prices. And so you can generate quite good returns if you can simply serve domestic markets. And often the reason that this doesn't happen is there just isn't the sufficient infrastructure domestically to make this easy. And then, of course, the other part of this is how do you embark upon creating these new farming systems, essentially, in a manner which puts or leaves as much of the benefit as possible with local people, and which avoids the use of, you know, extensive use of chemicals and, you know, traditional 20th century farming methods, which are horribly extractive and very expensive to implement and require spending lots of money on inputs, rather than a regenerative approach, which would typically have significantly lower input costs. And of course, in some places, as with the rice example, the output price that you can achieve as a farmer is materially better too. And so again, maybe a neat segue back to Monica to talk about another area. You mentioned beef before, of course. That's a hugely important area given how incredibly intensive it is in use of resources. You know, interested in what's happening on the beef front.
So, I mean, it's a shocking fact that Australia is the only OECD country where we are a deforestation hotspot. So we are clearing land at an alarming rate for beef cattle production. So, you know, what do we do about it? Now, Angelica, you talked about the importance of partnerships and having governments involved. And, you know, we've been talking to the Meat and Livestock Corporation. They have a carbon neutral by 2030 goal, a very, very ambitious aspiration to try and drive down decarbonisation, deforestation in beef cattle. And I guess, you know, coming back to the role of the finance industry and markets and consumers, having a product that supports consumption through deforestation-free beef, for example, is one way that I think we can certainly contribute to helping farmers to see the value of looking after the land in a more stewardship way, not clearing native forests, but also being able to have cattle on land at the same time as replanting trees, keeping the forests there as well. So there is a huge opportunity for Australia to market that deforestation-free beef. Not only in Australia, we are large exporters of beef to the Asia-Pacific region. In another life, I was a trade negotiator looking at agricultural products into Korea and Japan. And so I know that as Korean and Japanese consumers start to think more broadly about what food they are consuming and these issues, that they will be wanting products that are more consumer friendly and don't destroy the forest at the same time as they're consuming their food. So I think we're on a winner here if we can find the right market incentives to make that happen. And the beef cattle producers and many of them are smallholders as well, as large agribusiness to drive that change. So it's a very, very interesting opportunity over the next decade to be able to see those changes occur in the markets.
And of course, there are things like food additives for cattle to reduce methane emissions. I know that's been a fairly hot topic over the last couple of years, perhaps still a bit of a pathway from here to really widespread adoption of that at scale, given presumably challenges in manufacturing, sufficient supply. You also have to have the animals in a place where you know what they're eating and can make sure they're actually eating what they're supposed to be eating. Have you been much involved with that, Monica?
So there's a lot of innovation occurring with looking at how do we actually reduce the methane from the cattle burps and farts, as we call it, through the seaweed additives, Esophagopolis. So that is a very important process to undertake, but of course, like any innovation, it's expensive. The feed supplement is expensive, and if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of cattle, how do you try and make that shift in that valley of death from where it is now in experimental mode? We've seen the results, and they are really delivering results to making it available at a reasonable price for farmers. And we're not quite there yet. So, there's some way to go before we see it widespread adoption by beef cattle farmers. And I guess looking at more native grasses and different kind of methods for agriculture. We talk a lot about industrial agriculture versus smallholder, but there are, the principles of regenerative agriculture, where you're managing the land through cell grazing, or, you're really looking after the land so it isn't impacted in very deep ways with these hoofed animals, is certainly a principle. And we are seeing more and more consumers looking to support regenerative agriculture as well.
Yeah, and I visited Nep State last year in the UK, which is doing some really interesting things with how they're managing cattle on the land itself, hedgerows, bringing chickens through after the cattle have been through. And still early stages and still very small volumes there. So they have there's still significant questions over how you scale this up to have a really large impact, but at least demonstrating that's possible. It's probably, again, to keep moving on this theme as we try to cover as much ground as humanly possible in one short 60-minute discussion, but the whole theme of alternative proteins. I know I've had involvement in the world of animal-free dairy, where there is a company founded by Australians based in the US called Change Foods, which has been developing animal-free caseins specifically focused on cheese production. And the reason they've addressed that particular segment is, of all the places where we use protein from animals, the one that's probably hardest to substitute is in cheese products, because without the bioidentical caseins, it's very hard to make a cheese that actually works like a cheese, that tastes properly like a cheese, that melts and stretches like a cheese, that has what the nice folk from Upfield, for example, who, funnily enough, based just downstairs from us here in Sydney, would call mouthfeel. And of course, cheese is insanely intensive when it comes to use of resources, because it uses a huge amount of water. It creates a substantial amount of emissions thanks to the cattle. And it's, you know, when you see the charts of what are the things you should be most concerned about, cheese is well on the right-hand end of that. You should worry about it set of foods. And of course, you really need, finding proteins from plants is basically they don't work, at least with where the technology is now. So that's one example. Are there other examples you wanted to share of things you've seen that are really interesting in relation to, you know, alternative proteins generally? Because there's lots of different approaches here. It's not just cell-based fermentation, which is what the
I'm happy to share one example of a company out in Western Sydney here who have been developing alternative proteins through the use of cricket meal, which is a very, very high value protein source. I mean, we in maybe the Western world don't think about eating insects, but many people around the world do that on a regular basis. And you know, I'm sure our forefathers and mothers did the same. So they produce products, the protein meal that goes into pasta, goes into corn chips, and, you know, starting to put it into bread, banana bread. And if you taste it, if you weren't told that it had cricket meal in it, you really wouldn't know that it was there. And it's a much, you know, it's a low GI, really healthy, and they're starting to export this product as well to Southeast Asian countries, and I think we're going to see a huge increase in that. And I think part of it is cultural. You know, you talked about how important the cheese is in finding that alternative and that taste there, but it's also the cultural elements to it. And as our culture shifts and changes, and we've seen an uptake in vegetarian restaurants and an uptake in vegan products, I'm sure that we'll start to see more of this in our regular supermarkets as people start to see that is an effect. And I think alternative proteins, most certainly, you know, the Impossible Burger, we have burger chains around in the cities, and you can easily go in and find these alternative protein burgers. Whereas, you know, 3 years ago, when the X was launched, we couldn't find them. So there is certainly a lot more choice for consumers now to try it.
It's quite amazing how quickly some of these developments have happened. I can think, you know, 5 years ago in the UK, you know, which is one of the most of all the higher income countries, one with the highest proportion of vegetarians and vegans, partly because of a significant Indian community there. There was still very little vegetarian or vegan food in any kind of mainstream place. Whereas now you go to the local pub and have a pub dinner in your local gastropub, they'll have their own version of a vegan burger on the menu, very often just created using vegetables, not necessarily with any replacement that's even trying to be a meat replacement product. And the other point from the cultural thing you said, it's very easy, and I know I've been guilty of this, to think about the idea that, well, if you don't eat meat, where are you going to get your protein from? And of course, there's lots of sources of protein that have more protein in them than meat. And many people who put forward the argument saying you've got to have meat for protein don't necessarily even know what's in the meat in the first place. It's this, how do you improve awareness and show people things? So I know my kids who love their food in all sorts of shapes and forms prefer a burger which isn't even trying to be a beef burger that's animal free. They're just interested in, they like it, there's a particular kind of bean burger they just think is great. right? And it may still get an egg on top of it for the moment, but preferably from a very friendly and sustainable source. But they much rather have that than anything else. It's just making it part of what's normal. Angelica, you're smiling, so I think you've got an interesting story to share here.
I think that, you know, in this whole thing related to alternative protein, I think one point of attention is that it has to be organic alternative protein, right? Because if you look at beans, if you look at the soybeans, they are all, you know, okay, alternative, it's alternative protein. But where do you find the organic ones? And then, you know, as I said, in this ocean of soybeans out of monoculture, extensive, old-fashioned way, you know, how do you make sure that then you can really finance the transition, right? And then that's one of these value chains that there may be a premium price at the end. Right, so when you talk about grains transition into organic, these sorts of grains can really turn into this alternative milk, maybe alternative cheese, and there's a market for it. And, you know, and I think that people, you know, I think that's also part of the transition from the customer perspective, right? That it's, oh, I don't want to eat animal protein. But that's the first step. The second step is, if it's not animal protein, what sort of protein is it? And is it organic, or is it coming from, you know, conventional farming with lots of other subproducts part of it? So instead of eating healthier, maybe it's the opposite, right? So I think that this is really the cherry at the end of this. On the top of this cake of this value chain, which is this more sustainable grains. So this transition to more sustainable grains. I have a case in Brazil that is related to organic eggs. So the way that they structure the value chain is, okay, end of the day, what their main product is organic eggs. But to have the organic eggs, the chickens have to eat organic grains. So how do you go back into, you know, making sure that you have available smallholders that have transitioned from traditional to organic, and even more difficult many times is non-GMO, right? So soybeans and the corn, right, to feed the chicken that will then produce the egg that's going to be sold in the market. So I think that the arrangement of this value chain, really focusing on the final product, which is organic eggs, but then, you know, making all the entire movement backwards in the value chain and this transitioning was something very interesting. And I think that the same can apply in other sorts of vegan, vegetarian products as well.
Fantastic. And I think we're going to make a switch now to talk about industry in the built environment. But just before we do, a shout out for a couple of other companies I know in the last week or so. Good Meat in the US received the no action letter it needs, one of the 2 key approvals to be able to start selling its products to customers there. So that's, I think, a very significant development. And there has been, quite a race between some Asian countries that have been quite progressive on licensing for these foods, and the US, where it has been a much slower process to get licensing approvals. But it's good to see that progress. There are also companies like Every, which is making an egg substitute, which I confess I have not tried yet, but I plan to try very soon. And one thing there also interesting, the founder of that business is running for there's essentially a supervisory board for Harvard University, which is elected from the outside. So he's on the ticket for that, to bring a more progressive voice to the oversight of that institution. So I think just seeing some of these shifts play out, it's not just about the products and the businesses, it's about where can people use their influence more broadly to drive change. Because I know My daughter's at a university, and she's very keen on things related to sustainability, and the university does some fantastic things. And then there are other things where they're just doing nothing like enough at all. As a practical example, I think this is McGill University. The part of the university that deals with everything to do with sustainability is in a different location from the people that are doing finance. And it's very hard to take both sets of courses because you can't make your schedule work because the transit time between lectures is too great. That shouldn't be a hard problem to solve. But there are some of these little barriers. But so let's change it up a bit and then get to the other area I wanted to cover today, which is everything around the shifts that are required in partly energy generation, but we won't talk too much about that because a huge amount is already happening. The amount of solar built last year was, I think it's 268 gigawatts globally. About a third of that was rooftop solar. You've got the advent of things like solar tiles and solar shingles. So, you don't just have to put solar panels on your roof. You can put something on your roof when you're replacing it or building a new one, which just looks much more like the existing roof. There are also other people offering a complete system, which is a roof which looks like glass, that is just all solar. And this is economic enough that these aren't just being deployed in places like Australia or Texas, where energy prices are really high and there's a lot of sunshine. They're being built in Germany and the UK and Sweden, where solar intensity is maybe a third of Australia or less, but still economic and still attractive. So I think all of that is happening. In Australia, we've got some significant new wind developments now coming down off Gippsland, which is good to see. But that's all the kind of easy to decarbonize world. There's the things that have been labeled sometimes a little bit too conveniently as hard to decarbonize. So things like buildings and lime and cement and iron production and steel. I know, Monica, this is a subject that's close to your heart. What's happening? Are they still hard to decarbonize? Are some of them becoming surprisingly easy and cheap to decarbonize? What's the story?
Well, easy and cheap, I don't think that that is the case as yet, Nigel. And why are they hard to decarbonise? Because it's a chemical problem that they're trying to solve. If you put limestone into and cement into concrete to harden it, to make it stand the test of time, the 50 years or so that a bridge needs to stand up or a building needs to remain in place, then you want it to be structurally sound, and traditionally it's been using cement limestone, and it's the chemical process to develop the clinker that makes that occur. Same with the manufacture of steel. It's the chemicals that are released that create the problem. So what are we doing here? So I guess there's a huge amount of interest globally by these hard to decarbonise companies and sectors to drive emission reductions. Many of them have have set science-based targets under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and that includes them looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, their value chain emissions. A number of construction firms have also been setting science-based targets, so they're looking at their supply chain emissions, and through, again, coming back to this theme of partnerships, where government and industry working together. Here in Australia, I have set up an alliance of organisations, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, because no one sector and no one company can do it alone, and we have to work together to drive down that decarbonisation through government procurement, getting governments to actually put in place for their tendering and procurement documents, because they are the major developers and investors in infrastructure projects to drive that decarbonisation. So it's not just about cost, quality and time, but carbon is also included in the assessments for how these infrastructure projects move forward. And of course, industry has to play a key role in helping to drive the innovation, because often, the materials manufacturers, so cement, concrete, aluminium, they say, well, we don't know if there's demand for low carbon materials, therefore we're not going to invest in the innovation, the millions and billions of dollars. Our shareholders won't appreciate that, because we want a return on investment for our shareholders. So we have to be able to bring the demand side, the head contractors and government agencies to the table and say, well, here's the demand for these materials, and then the materials manufacturers can start to have some confidence that they can invest in the innovation that's occurring. And, from the launch of our initiative in April 2021, right in the middle of the sort of the COVID wave to now, we've seen a huge increase in interest by governments here in Australia in particular, to drive decarbonisation and support, encourage, as the Green Building Council likes to talk about, with sticks, carrots and tambourines. So you need to have the regulatory sticks to put in place, and lifting the regulatory boundary to shift the curve to the other end. You need to have the carrots, you need those incentives for industry to change. And then the tambourines, we need to shout out to say, these companies and organisations are doing some fantastic work here to drive that decarbonisation story. So, the built environment, 40% of global emissions come from the buildings we live in and work in, and the roads we drive on and the trains and metros we catch. So if we can drive, and we can't do without concrete, we need to have concrete, we need steel, we need aluminium, we also need timber, and we're starting to see more conversation around regenerative materials. So, think mycelium walls and, the use of natural materials that can be put into the schools that we build, so that the next generation of students coming through, they see, oh, mycelium walls, and that they see it as just a natural part of their living environment. More nature and plants being put in place, green walls. The shift that's occurring is pretty significant. And if I can just sort of talk about steel decarbonisation for a moment.
Yeah, I'll just to give 1 second, just on because I know on lime and cement, one of the things here is there a carbon price or not? Of course, in Europe, the EU ETS price recently floated above 100 euros a tonne. It's back down at something like 87 or 88 euros a tonne now. But so one of the technologies for decarbonising lime and cement is something called lilac, originally created by an Australian company called Calix. And the cost of implementing that there is no marginal capital cost and there's no marginal operating cost. So if you're building a new kiln, you can have one of these kilns for the same price as an existing kiln, and your cost of running it is the same as running an existing kiln. And indeed, there are some areas in which it will be materially cheaper than running an existing kiln, because it can do some clever things that an ordinary kiln can't. So the only cost you've got is the transport and storage cost, which should be in the order of 15 euros a tonne or something like that, so long as you don't have really long distance shipping. Right. And so if you're a European cement manufacturer and you implement this, it's not even cheap to implement, it's ridiculously profitable. The challenge, of course, is the first, it's been demonstrated at 30,000 tonne a year scale, 100,000 tonne a year scale, which is the first of a kind for true large scale production, is being commissioned and being built as we speak. But once that's up and running and people can see it works, then suddenly lime and cement goes from how are we going to do this to why aren't we doing more of it? And the interesting, Australia doesn't have a carbon pricing quite the same way, but we do have a carbon pricing mechanism where if you can generate carbon offsets at a low enough price, then could be significant value in that. So I think all of that some of these things will change, just as we've seen in food where there were no vegan burgers on most menus and now they're all over the place. This is something which even in the slow moving world of heavy industry can begin to change quite quickly. And
Yes.
just as a, sorry, go on.
Oh, I wanted to share with you another Australian company, Minerals Carbonation International, MCI. So they've developed a technology, again, using the principle of physics and chemistry, wonderful science, to use sort of carbon capture and utilisation through enhanced weathering, but also that utilisation to be able to draw carbon out of the whether it's concrete being manufactured or steel. And they are starting to really see some great gains in emission reductions as well, and going from that pilot phase to more commercialization, building it out. So I'm hopeful, like you, Nigel, that we'll be able to solve some of those big challenges, and we won't be able to call it hard to decarbonize very soon.
Well, I mean, everyone who knows me knows I've been slightly obsessed about lime for a few years, because the other part of it, of course, is if you've got a way of making lime where you can capture the CO2 in the process of making it, you've then got a very low cost pathway to direct air capture, because there are a few things better in the world for capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere than lime. And Breakthrough Energy Ventures has a business called Heirloom, which has recently entered an MOU with the Lilac business to deploy that technology in direct air capture. So there are some knock-on benefits from these things as well. Now, I've got one, keeping an eye on the clock here because we're fast running towards the end, but you wanted to mention iron and steel, which is obviously another incredibly emissions intensive segment. What's happening on that front?
Well, yes. So I guess one of the key focuses for us here in Australia, we have traditionally been a dig it up and ship it out economy. And if we are going to support other countries to decarbonise as well as our own, we need to be shifting towards, making sure that we can export value-added critical minerals, which we have a huge abundance of, as well as value adding to our iron ore and being a manufacturer of choice for green, so green, in inverted commas, iron, to go into steel manufacturing around the world. So where we ship iron ore into China, Japan, and Korea, and hopefully to India as well, we can help to deliver a value-added product to drive that decarbonisation story. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next few years with steel decarbonisation. There's a very big focus on that, Japan, Korea, India as well, and China. So we will need a lot of steel. We need a lot of these minerals if we are going to create, smart, successful economies where we support decarbonisation, not just in the rich developed world, but also in the developing countries that we're all surrounded by. So, Australia has been talking about being a renewable energy superpower and a critical mineral superpower. And I guess we're starting to see that evolve as investors are looking to invest in these value-added supply chains here in Australia and build out, those supply chains in different countries close to us as well.
Yeah. So, and this is business like Fortescue Future Industries is obviously significantly involved in all of this.
Fortescue, BHP, Rio, yes, very, very much so.
And so I think we need to head back around to the other side of the world. And, one area I know about, which is not on many people's radar screens, is the treatment of sewage. Sewage treatment consumes something like 2 to 3% of all the world's electricity in order to blow air through the aeration tanks, which is where the microbes do their work to digest the sewage. And there is a business from the US called Prosper Technologies that has got a very energy efficient way of introducing gas or dissolving gases in liquids, where one of the best places to use that from a commercial point of view is in wastewater treatment. And the link to Brazil is the first major customer is BRK, one of the largest wastewater treatment processing companies in Brazil, owned mostly by BlackRock. And of course, Brazil, of all the world's larger countries, is the one that probably has the most significant challenges around dealing with wastewater, partly given growing populations and things like that. So it's great to see, there is a practical solution that has been demonstrated to work that is now being adopted. But again, it's something that most people would not think of. And I'll use that as a segue to head back towards Latin America and ask Angelica, is there any examples you wanted to share around activity in the fields of industrial decarbonization or energy more broadly in Brazil? Of course, Brazil was the home of biofuels in the world. It's a country which implemented biofuels a long time ago. And if you get petrol in your car, then it's 26% ethanol, if I remember rightly, or something like that. And the ethanol comes from biofuels. So in theory, a sustainable resource, so long as the farming is done in an appropriate manner. Maybe we won't get into that today. But Angelica, over to you.
In my past life, I worked for a cement company. So when you start discussing, about just as a side note, right, all these things related to decarbonization and the lime and the cement kiln. I think one point very relevant that Monica mentioned has to do with science-based targets, right? I think that's going to be that has to be a key element, because I remember from my times in that world that at a certain stage you thought of really having this label, like green label for cement. And I said, but green cement kind of, like it's not only a matter of the label, but okay, so what's being done and what are the science-based targets and how are those being met? So it's good to hear that there are technological solutions for that. And I think that's very much needed. It can be really added to part of a discussion that has been going on.
I'll come back to you in 1 second, but I'll get Paul to join us as well now, because I know he'll want to add something on science-based targets. But Angelica, keep going.
It's just a side note, because of my past life. I worked for 10 years for a cement company and really trying, in all that had to do with more sustainable ways to do it. So it's very interesting to see that there is this solution, potential solution in place. And then in terms of biofuels, I think that, the challenge for Brazil has always been that the energetic matrix, right? So the energy matrix for Brazil, it's already clean because of hydropower, right? So it has for many years been very difficult to come with any other sorts of solutions, because there's always this story behind it being, and it is, right? So hydropower, it's clean. But you have to look at, again, like the life cycle of such sort of energy, right? And then, yes, in terms of biofuels, the sugar cane and the ethanol, cars run both in Brazil, so weather allows that. And then the windmills. But I know there has been some new developments there, but that's not my area of expertise, so I cannot tell much more about it.
Yeah, and just if anyone didn't know, every car sold in Brazil since about 2014 can run off pure ethanol, i.e. bioethanol. It's possible. So the country can shift the content of bioethanol in its fuel to match what's available out of agriculture, and could happily increase that significantly if it wanted to, and all the cars will still work. So a neat example of government policy creating some flexibility. Now, we mentioned science-based targets, and we've got a few minutes to go, and I know science-based targets is a subject that's close to both Monica's heart and Paul's heart. Paul, you've got anything you want to share around what larger companies have been doing in this space? Because part of what we're talking about has been the front lines of innovation, but of course, all these things have to be used by a whole host of other companies to achieve reductions in their emissions, etc.
Sure, companies and their supply chain. So what's exciting is the growing number of companies that are committing to science-based targets, and in some cases to net zero. Of course, we'd like to see absolute zero, not just net zero, but real gross reductions. But there are more than 2,400 organizations, either companies, governments, airports, and other entities that are committing to science-based targets. They range anywhere from 100% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030, super aggressive. They made some of those commitments in 2020. And companies like that include Novo Nordisk is one. Unilever, I think, is probably more of a net zero target than a gross zero target. And companies like Hannon Armstrong, which provide the funding and financing for solar and other renewable energies. So that sets a high bar, both in time frame, 2030, and now is 7 years away. And at 100%, we'll make it easy. If it takes you 10 years, you need 10% reduction. It's actually a little bit less when you compound. It's only 8% a year, but you got to do it every year. So to get 8% anything every year, when you're reducing it, stripping it out of a carbon economy, is pretty difficult. So some examples are Johnson Controls, for example. They have energy sensors, energy efficiency, software connections. And so something that Johnson Controls CEO said that was pretty amazing, this is going on 15 years ago now, the Johnson Controls CEO said, at least for the US, if all our customers used all our products, we could reduce primary demand 25%. So that's just waiting to be achieved. And so a science-based target can help spur return on investment, because less energy is less cost. It's also less carbon. It's less of an energy footprint.
I'm just going to add another example like that, which is there's a Perth-based business called CIM, which provides systems that can be installed in office buildings and the like to gather data from all the things that run in those buildings which generate data, and implementation of that platform enables cost savings even in newly built buildings where you think it would be quite well optimized by something like 20 to 25%, just through better management of what's already there and automating as much of the decision making around what needs to be done. So it's like your Johnson Controls example. It's extraordinary that there are these huge efficiencies, although perhaps not surprising, because the person that built the building doesn't pay the electricity bill.
That's right.
Anyway, keep going, Paul.
Yeah, well, more of that is happening. Companies like Schneider Electric or Jones Lang LaSalle are taking a systems approach and a systems view approach. And we're talking about solutions and innovations here on ESGX. One innovation that is slow to catch on is Schneider Electric and a handful of other companies writing annual reports that start with the limits of the earth to sustain us as humanity and our technology. And so first they write about the earth's limits and the stakeholders, and then they say, here's how our business operates within those limits and across disciplines. So that's something, a few years back, Clorox wrote an integrated report to integrate environmental and social and governance with the business fundamentals. But taking it a couple steps higher, which is, here's the whole operating environment, here's the earth's limits and air, water, land, and the like. Here's the limits of humanity and what we can absorb and how fast. So that's really compelling, as well as its full product suite. So I'll just pause there because I know we're running out of time, but wanted to make sure we talked about some of those global, multinational, multi-time zone, multicultural examples. You're on mute, Nigel.
It was bound to happen once. Let's maybe just do final 30-second comment from maybe Monica first and then Angelica around, the one message for everybody to take away today.
So just a quick shout out to all the work that is being done. We've had the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. We now have the task force on nature-related financial disclosure. And I know there's a task force on inclusion-related financial disclosure. And while disclosure is one part of it, I can see, companies, governments, we're really rolling up our sleeves as we deal with the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. living in the one planet, having to do that. And I really think that we have shifted our mindset. It is a cultural paradigm shift that needs to happen. And we need to be driving that, and I feel very privileged in being in the position that we are now to help to sort of really get us on track to live within that one planet. So thank you.
Fantastic. Angelica.
I think the main message is that different business models require different investors models, right? And different players. So de-risking, the way it is being approached, it has been very tough, right? It's really de-risking the old way. Why I think that it has a lot to do with more innovative approaches and taking the risk to be first movers in certain segments. So let's say that it's the investment being done in trying to really change something and then starting a new business, not a new business model, but different business models that are more sustainable require different sorts of investors' spirits and motivations.
Fantastic. Well, Angelica and Monica, thank you both very much for all your thoughts and perspectives today. It's wonderfully informative, certainly uplifting. Paul, any final words from you?
Final words are, there's plenty of examples to take action. We talk about innovation. You don't have to do something new. You just have to copy something innovative, and the risk is reduced. So there's plenty of innovative examples that we've talked about today here in this discussion, in the 81 episodes of ESGX over the past 3 years, tangible things that have already been done, and in the books that we've profiled here on ESGX as well, including Earth for All and the Global Handbook for Impact. So we invite you to take action, and when you do, come to ESGX to talk about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. And I think so much of what we're talking about is that there are there are good solutions that can be implemented. It's so much about the human level of changing the way people think about certain things and changing how they act on them. And that's something that we can all lean our shoulders into every single day. So thank you all very much for a fantastic discussion, and see you all next time on ESGX Live.
Thank you.